Yo, what's going on, guys? Drew from Future Strategy Gaming coming at you with our new player guide to tanking. Now, whether or not you're new to tanking in MMOs or you're new to Final Fantasy XIV, but have experience in other MMOs, hopefully this guide here is a good place for you to start. Do me a favor, before we get started, make sure you hit that like button if you like the video. If you want to see more of this content or some of my other content in the future, make sure you hit subscribe. All right, let's get it. First thing we're going to talk about is aggro and AoE mechanics. Now, the word enmity is going to be Final Fantasy XIV's word for threat or aggro. Big thing about enmity, just make sure that the threat ability is on. Each tank is going to have their own one. Sometimes when you get into group content, it'll toggle off. Just toggle it back on. Now with AoE mechanics, knowing how your initial AoE works, for the two starting tanks that you have available to you, you have the Paladin, which has Total Eclipse. It is a whirlwind effect with a 5-yard range, whereas the Warrior has Overpower, which is a frontal cone that has an 8-yard range. If you're new to tanking and you're just getting started, I highly recommend actually starting on the Paladin. For this particular reason, you don't have to worry about positioning other than making sure that they're in 5-yard range of you. Whereas with the Warrior, that frontal cone requires an additional layer of you making sure, hey, is this going to hit everybody because it's in a cone effect? It can be a little daunting to some newer players. If you play one of the other two tanks, Gunbreaker has Demon Slice. That's also a 5-yard range whirlwind. But Dark Knight has Flood of Darkness, which is a frontal line attack, and it has a 10-yard range. So it won't extend out like that Warrior's frontal cone, but it'll go a little farther. Like I said, this adds that additional layer. So you just have to be mindful of it. Use one of the abilities that is a little bit easier to manage. Now, AoE mechanics go both ways, and what I mean to say by that is you need to do your best to avoid any abilities that are cast by enemy mobs to reduce the amount of healing needed from any unnecessary damage that you've taken and make that run a little bit smoother. Next up, let's talk about large pools and using mitigation. Lower level dungeons, when you're doing like your leveling roulette or you're just getting started, you'll have less abilities available to you. So because of that, I'd highly recommend against larger pulls. This goes for all your other teammates, so they'll have less AoE abilities, less healing abilities. So it's just recommended that you don't do huge pulls in the earlier dungeons. That being said, you want to use your tanking cooldowns frequently. Reprisal, Rampart, whatever your class specific one, those come up very frequently, a minute to 2 minutes at most. If you're coming from another MMO like WoW, where a lot of the defensive cooldowns are, almost feel like 5 minutes or longer, it's not going to be like this. They encourage you to use it frequently so that you can mitigate as much damage as possible. So make sure you're doing so. If you're worried, oh no, what if it's going to not be available on the boss? Two things on that one. One, it probably will be, if not at the beginning, during at some point. And two, none of the bosses really have any mechanics that are going to instantly kill you that you didn't stand in, which is your fault to begin with. So it's not going to be a huge deal. Use those abilities. For mitigating some damage is using line of sight to pull range mobs in. Range mobs have a tendency to stand in a very awkward space, and if they're split out, you can't get your whole team to AoE everything. When you have threat on them, just go around a corner or find a pillar or something to run behind so that they have to come over to attack you. This will help get them together, making you AoEing and keeping threat on them a little bit easier, and also allowing your team to DPS them down a little bit quicker. Leads me to my next point, keep your eyes up. Now you always want to keep an eye on your party members to ensure that they haven't pulled any additional mobs. If they do, it's not a big deal. You have a couple of different ways you can go grab them. First, you can just run over and start using your spamming AoE abilities. You can also provoke, which is a 30-second cooldown taunt. Or you can use your range ability to try to peel enmity off of another player. This might happen sometimes at the beginning of the pools when a healer has a regen effect on you and they can pull healer aggro, because healer aggro is pretty high. Another recommendation for keeping your eyes up to make it a little bit easier for you is to use the enemy list that is in the UI to confirm whether or not you have aggro. So the enemy list, do yourself a favor when you first get started in tanking. Change your UI up a little bit, move it into an area that doesn't require you to look around all crazy. Now, when you have this list, you see an enemy on it. To the left of their names, you're going to see a small square-ish icon. I say square-ish because it's a square, but it's rounded on the corners. Now, the icons will change color based on their threat to a particular player. If they are red, then that means they are aggro to you. As a tank, that's what you want. So Just make sure everyone's on red. If they're not, you can either try to find the mob by looking around, clicking the mob's frame right there, and using any of your abilities to get it over to you. Another reason to keep your eyes up is for additional mobs while engaging in fights. You'll see this commonly on boss fights, but there are some staged events during dungeons that have additional mobs come in later on. So just being aware of your surroundings and trying to figure out what you need to do is a big deal. That's why you want to keep those eyes up. All right, let's talk about pacing. In the earlier dungeons, like I said earlier, you're not going to have as many abilities. What you'll see in later dungeons is what is described in the Final Fantasy XIV community as wall-to-wall pulls. Those can be great, but it doesn't always have to be how you go about doing it. Wall-to-wall pulling is essentially starting at one spot and pulling all the way until the dungeon no longer lets you move on until you kill these mobs. If you're not comfortable with it, or if you feel like your healer's already struggling to keep up with you, don't do it. It's totally fine. No one's going to haze you for not pulling as much as they want. If you're not comfortable, this is you as the tank. You need to make sure that you're doing the right things to make sure that you don't die. Which leads me to my better version, in my opinion, for pacing of new tanks: chain pulling. Now, chain pulling is an efficient way to clear dungeons. It can be faster depending on your group. But what I mean by chain pulling is when you're engaged with a group, you start to see the group's health teeter around 20 to 15%. It's actually my recommendation to start moving on to the next group. While your current group will get AoE down by some of your team members, that next group you can get started and engage in, and it keeps a flow up. It keeps people engaged and wanting to stay focused while you move through the dungeon. The only thing to worry about in that particular case would be my next topic. So you're always going to want to keep an eye on the mana of your healer. Find your party frames, make sure you can see which one your healer is, and take a look at that second bar on the right. They do have cooldowns to help them with mana regen, so constantly chain pulling or going for another huge pull right after you just completed one could leave your healer in a tight spot. I would judge the speed of the pulls based on your healer's cooldown usage. If you're new to this can actually take a little while to develop as a skill, but I'd recommend you look over at your healer's frames, their health and mana bar, every 30 to 45 seconds, and look for this icon that I've posted on the screen for you. This is Lucid Dreaming. Lucid Dreaming is their mana regen ability. If you see this on the healer, then you know that they are trying to keep their mana topped off or regen. My recommendation, if the healer's mana isn't going up and it's 40% or lower, and you just got done, probably wait a little bit and let them regen a little bit before you pull that next pull. All right, last tip I'll go with is make use of all of your abilities, including your role actions. So the role actions I actually feel when I see newer tanks are underutilized. So first off is going to be low blow. This is a 6-second stun. If you picked a paladin, you're going to get a stun as part of one of your class abilities. However, that will affect your damage rotation. Low blow is off the global cooldown and is a really underutilized spell in my opinion. It'll help you mitigate some damage because that mob's not going to be able to attack for a little bit. Now, interject is a 30-second cooldown interrupt. And I think Final Fantasy XIV does a fantastic job of showing players what spell can be interrupted. Whereas some other modes, it's kind of trial and error. When it comes to 14, if a spell can be interrupted, the cast bar for that spell, wherever that is on your screen, will blink instead of staying stagnant. It'll take a little getting used to see what I mean on that one. If that's the case, interrupt that thing. Make sure that you're not taking any damage from that. I would highly recommend, if you're comfortable going into UI settings, finding that enemy cast bar and enlarging that just to make it a little bit easier for you to see. Arm's length is another role action. This is a movement cancellation action. It makes sure that the tank doesn't get jerked around. You don't get knocked back or pulled in from most abilities. Obviously, there's some boss specific ones that require you to get pulled. The reason this is a good thing, and I'm speaking from an Astrologian main, there are going to be class abilities that are ground targeted AoEs. And if you're getting jerked around as a tank and moving the mobs, they potentially will not hit all the mobs. The Astro one deals damage and heals. There's nothing more frustrating than waiting 10 seconds for this thing to charge up and explode. And in the last 2 seconds, the tank gets knocked back, the whole group moves, and you miss out on that ability. Very frustrating. Please, please don't move around a lot. Find a zone, stick to that zone, let people play around that. One of the other role actions you'll have is Shirk. I'm not going to talk about this. Don't use this unless you're in 8-man content. And if you're in 8-man content, you probably didn't need this guide to begin with. So thanks for coming and watching it, I guess. Sprint. Use Sprint. I see Sprint only being utilized in lower level dungeons as in-between pulls to kind of speed up. That's cool, but it can be way more useful. If you are pulling a large amount of group and one of your teammates pulls aggro while you're trying to get set up, you can sprint back to them. If you're on a boss fight and you're a little bit slow to react to an AoE mechanic, you can use Sprint to help you get out of it. I think it's really underutilized and something that needs to be used more frequently. So make sure that's on your bar in a comfortable hotkey so that way you can utilize that as frequently as possible. It's only a 60-second cooldown. You might as well do it. So the last thing I'll leave you with, this isn't necessarily a tip, but more of a recommendation and a general ask as someone who plays a lot. Just ask questions. There is nothing wrong with you saying, I don't know this. Can you explain it for me? I was in a level 50 Heaven's Ward dungeon today that I had never seen before. I'm not sure how I'd never seen it before because I've done this a lot and I'd never seen this dungeon before. And at the beginning I said, hey, I'm new to this. Is there anything I should know? Yeah, only this thing, and we'll talk about bosses when we get there. Cool. We'd get to bosses. I would type TLDR question mark. If there was anything that needed to be noted, they would say. If it was, hey, this is a tank and spank, they would say. But I asked the question. I can't help you as a player that has some knowledge if you're not asking those questions. And we are a very accepting community. We are not going to flame you for not knowing anything. We actually encourage people to ask questions so that your knowledge of the game increases just as much as ours does. So please, just do it. And that brings us to the end of the video. Whew, 12 minutes. I don't think I breathed during that whole thing. I felt like I talked pretty fast. Anyways, if you made it this far, thank you so much for checking out this video. I really appreciate that. If you want to see more of these videos, make sure that you subscribe to my content, hit that bell notification so you can see any of my current and future content. If you liked the video, smash that like button. If you didn't like the video, hit dislike. It really doesn't hurt. Seriously. I mean, I'll be offended because, I'm human, but when it comes to YouTube, they don't really care. So, as always, thanks for giving me your time today. I'm Drew from Future Strategy Gaming. Enjoy the rest of that day. Peace.